Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner representing the United States, Emmanuel Macron, Merz of Germany, Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom, and Zelensky of Ukraine all met in Paris, and they talked for hours and hours and hours trying to hammer out the finer details of a negotiated peace settlement. But more importantly, what comes after a peace settlement? What comes the day after to make sure that the Russians don't invade again? From the first meeting that Zelensky and Donald Trump had, this issue has been contentious. Those who have been following the war would know that the issue of deterrence, trying to stop the Russians from invading again in the day after, is the issue. It is how you get the Ukrainians to agree to anything. Because if you tell Ukrainians, you will pass this war to another generation of Ukrainians, or maybe you will pass this war down to your children. The suffering you had to face and the suffering your kids have already faced doing their classes underground, having to run off to bomb shelters. Maybe it'll happen again in 5 years. Maybe it'll happen again in 10. Maybe it'll happen again in 15. Who knows? Who knows? You needed to create a situation of endurance, of endurance. Ukrainians have a lot of endurance. But you have to create a situation of deterrence. You have to create deterrence. If you don't have deterrence, you're not going to get the Ukrainians to agree. And any peace deal you make is only useful as a delay because the Russians could invade again. And considering that, Vladimir Putin's wrote essays about how Ukraine is an extension of Russia. He has talked openly and privately with Putin. I said with Putin, I meant with Trump. That's a Freudian slip. He's talked privately with Trump about how he sees it as an extension, about all these historical justifications he's had. You can watch his interview with Tucker Carlson if you wanted to listen to him rant like a history Redditor for a while about it. So he has all the motivation in the world. He's still a revanchist. So you have to create a structure that would create such a disincentive, that would be so destructive towards Russia for them to invade again that they shan't consider it. No, I couldn't think about it. If I was to do that, then our army would get hurt in this way, our economy would be hurt in that way. It would be so destructive. Make it so when John Mearsheimer says, oh, the Russians would never invade, that's actually true. And it isn't just naivete or hopefulness that the Russians wouldn't actually do such a thing. But it is something that's based in physical power. It's based in a cold calculation that I will not take a step forward because if I do, I will be shot. So that calculation has kept peace on a lot of places around the world. It's kept peace in Berlin for the entirety of the nuclear missile crisis, the entirety of the Cold War. And it kept the peace on the Korean Peninsula after the end of the Korean War. But if you don't create the structures of deterrence, then you can't do it. And the problem has been that the United States has kept itself distant. Not only that the United States doesn't seem to want to take the actions to motivate Russia to come to the table through physical force, i.e. giving Ukraine the tools necessary to put enough pressure on the Russians that their casualty ratio is too significant for them to continue. So it's not just a calculation of, should we, shouldn't we, but man, we need an escape hatch. Man, we need a lifeboat to get out of this. Man, and we need to ditch this. We need to ditch the seed. And look, it's not as simple as, oh, is Russia losing a lot of men? Oh, they're also spending a lot of money. So the calculation obviously is to end the war. If that was the case, then Donald Trump's negotiations of 24 hours might have worked, but it didn't work. We're way past the 24-hour mark, okay? I mean, within 14 days, it'll be officially 365 days of negotiation that has not ended the war, has not ended it. So obviously, that's not the case. You need to do something to compel them to think that they have to. And this might be more difficult than your average state because we don't know how much information Putin is getting that is accurate. For example, the government of Russia announced multiple times that they captured Kupiansk, and then the Ukrainians pushed them out of Kupiansk. They announced they captured it like 3 times. It was quite humiliating. Zelensky went up to the gate of Kupiansk and took video. Putin tried to respond to it by saying, oh, why don't you walk into Kupiansk? But it didn't work. And so I think that he wouldn't be going out and making those bold proclamations unless there were people under him who were getting awards for their accomplishments by telling him that they had achieved things that would rather say that they had achieved things when maybe it hasn't been achieved, or said that they could be achieved by a certain day when they cannot. Like, for example, capturing Pokrovsk by November. Okay, and then move to December. Okay, well, then before the end of the year, before Christmas. And so the intake of information that Putin has could be incomplete due to the structure of their government. So it's not just that you need to convince the Russians that that it costs too much, or even that they're losing. You need to convince them that to continue would be catastrophe.
Is a curd.
So the question of deterrence had to be answered, and a lot of plans had been floated around about how do you deter the Russians from invading again. And the easy solution was always, even though of course this comes with commitment, was always NATO troops on the ground. It might not have to be a NATO mission due to the diplomatic niceties of trying to actually find a settlement with the Russians, but you would have British, French, German, Finnish, Swedish, and any number of other NATO states troops, including the United States, and I would think integrally including the United States. It's much more important that the United States be included than the Portuguese. And then they dot the front line, disincentivizing another Russian attack, because another Russian attack on Ukraine would also be a Russian attack on Germany, would be on the United Kingdom, and any other nation state that had its forces on the ground. You would not want it to be too much of a force or too large of a force to overburden either America's wallet or the Ukrainian local logistics system, but you would want it to be enough that it would have to trigger an American response. Essentially, a tripwire force is what it would be commonly referred to as. This would be one of the easiest ways. The problem is that while the United States is very interested in being prominent in negotiations, having a prominent role in Ukrainian resource extraction, having a prominent role in the business relationship and the rebuilding of the country, they don't want to have a prominent role when it comes to actually defending Ukraine or defense commitments. Despite the United States saying that they would be with Ukraine as long as it takes, and that eventually Ukraine was sure to be in NATO, now this new administration has the position that, as long as it takes might be a little bit too long, and you eventually be in NATO might actually be, well, eventually, not talk about it, actually not really, never mind. And that's the current administration's position. That doesn't mean it'll be the position of the next administration, but that's the current administration's position. And so the back and forth has essentially been Europe trying to get the United States to sign on to more defense commitments in order to get them to sign on more into a peace agreement, because they didn't want to basically be left on their own supporting Ukraine, when not only is that a problem, period, but to divide the NATO alliance in that way when it comes to each other's defense priorities, after we're the only nation state that's ever called Article 5 after we were attacked. But there's also a question of transition. There's also a question of Europe needs American defense articles. Europe needs the R&D research agreements that we've already made with each other to continue, that those programs need to finalize, that the deals that have already been signed and the weapons that have already been shipped that require American approval need to keep having American approval if they were to transfer from Europe to Ukraine. Man, it's not even just a question about American produced weapons. It's also a question of American produced technology, where even the Storm Shadow missiles that the United Kingdom gave to Ukraine, that type of munition needs American approval because American technology is in it. And that's how the system was set up. So this has been the crucial divide. This is the divide that caused the blow up at the White House, with Zelensky saying, you can't really just trust the Russians on their own. You need defense commitments, and you need to make it credible that they won't invade again. Without that, all of this is basically worthless. It's caused blowups, it caused arguments, but ultimately everyone knows Zelensky was right. Zelensky was right that yes, you need defense articles, you need defense commitments in order to stop the Russians from invading again, and that you need to pressure the Russians if you want to get them to the table. We seem to gotten closer to realizing the first one. The second one is taking more time. We're starting to see more progress on the economic front. The CIA is still working with Ukraine. The United States is giving Ukraine information when it comes to the crucial components of Russia's refineries that need to be struck and where they are. So we are assisting their campaign of pressure, but we're not directly contributing to their campaign of pressure. To give the United States an air of deniability, to separate ourselves from the actions that need to be taken. Where I am of the opinion that we don't separate ourselves from the actions that need to be taken, we just take those actions. We just take those actions and understand that right now Russia is in the disadvantaged position, restricting their ability to escalate with us, because the areas that they can escalate, we're higher on the escalation ladder. Like a direct blow-to-blow conflict with the United States would not be in the benefit of the Russians, and we need to sometimes not act like warmongers, but acknowledge that fact when engaging in diplomacy, especially if we're trying to engage in the type of forceful diplomacy that Trump talked about on the campaign trail, the type of peace through strength that actually could compel an end to this bloodletting. So that's what we needed. Did we get that at this conference? Did we get the United States security guarantees at this conference? Well, let me tell you, there was a draft plan that was put out to the press. Let me tell you what is in this plan, and you can help me splice the specifics, because it does seem like there's a commitment for America's support, but exactly what that support would be is not fully defined. Here's the plan. The plan, which still needs to be approved by Washington, sets out security guarantees that would include participation in U.S.-led ceasefire monitoring. So the ceasefire monitoring that is trying to check if there's an artillery fire, who fired it, trying to stop that from happening again, having forces in place to respond to that, to stop any offensives and stuff from taking place, that would be U.S.-led. So that's America, once again, asserting its front and center position in this process, the position of influence that it wants. Long-term support for the Ukrainian army. So that means the United States and Europe getting Ukraine the support that it needs, artillery guns and such. The deployment of multinational forces in Ukraine in case of a peace settlement. That means it's an outline that once peace is settled, multiple nations will send their forces in order to deter an invasion, essentially acting like that tripwire force we talked about. But not only that, but it also, there was more detail given during the press conference by Keir Starmer and others, that they want to help set up logistical hubs and supply nodes and defenses and help build those, literally send in the contractors, send in the people to help build up Ukraine's physical defenses. So it not just be a question of, here is the weapons to defend yourself, and here is peacekeepers to act as a tripwire, but also here is construction and support in that construction of, nodes of supply and other things to defend yourself in the event you need it in a future attack. That was talked in detail by Keir Starmer in the full press conference. We're not going to watch the full thing. We're watching Q&A in a second. What else is there? Let me read more. According to the document, Washington would deploy a, and I quote, continuous, reliable ceasefire monitoring system in Ukraine, and a special committee would be set up to address ceasefire breaches. So essentially, we would find some system that is reliable and consistent to monitor these things, and then have a board, a committee that once there is an artillery firing, or once there is a artillery, an airstrike, would come out and discuss it publicly, present the evidence, and talk about it. Mechanisms by which to respond to that, in tying in next steps and consequences, they haven't written that out here, but I assume the peacekeeping force and the munitions that are being provided to Ukraine could be what you would use for the response, but no outline for how it would work out in the details. This is very, very bare bones. A multinational force that is, and I quote, European-led. So the ceasefire monitoring is American-led, but the multinational force of peacekeepers on the ground to actually act as a tripwire and to disincentivize another Russian attack, that will be European-led with, and I quote, U.S. participation. uh, would be deployed in Ukraine in the event of a peace deal with Russia. The U.S. would contribute support in the form of intelligence, which we're already doing currently, and logistics, as well as a commitment to, and I quote, back the force if it is attacked. Now, intelligence, I already understand how that would work. I see it right now with how the CIA is providing the Ukrainians the intelligence of where the most crucial components in Russian refineries are so they can aim for it with their drones, right? Logistics, maybe this would mean helping to build up the logistics hubs, and that was being talked about by Keir Starmer. Maybe it's that, maybe it's something else. Infrastructure, potentially. Maybe this is a repackaging of infrastructure and rebuilding of the country as logistics work. I mean, of course, infrastructure supports logistics, but the last part is what leaves me pickled, what leaves me confused. A commitment to back the force if it attacks.
Occurred is occurred.
What does that mean? So I don't understand what exactly that means. Commitment to back the force if it's attacked. Does that mean sending weapons? Well, it's already defined that we're going to send weapons to Ukraine and stuff after this. America sells them, Europe buys them is the deal that Trump's very excited about. There's the Pearl program. What does it mean to back the force if it's attacked? Does that mean troops on the ground? Well, I mean, if it was troops on the ground, why wouldn't you just say troops on the ground? If the intention is to deter a future Russian invasion, then you would say, and that's the purpose of saying back the force if it is attacked. If you were willing to do troops on the ground, you would say troops on the ground, because troops on the ground would create more deterrence, which would make it less likely you would have to put the troops on the ground in the first place than if you were to be vague about it and then actually meant put troops on the ground and now we have soldiers in there. So I don't think it means troops on the ground. I think if he meant troops on the ground, he would maybe say that we're participating in the multinational force. We have troops available for Venezuelan oil, but we don't have troops available to help maintain the peace in Europe. That seems to be the Trumpian position. So the only conclusion I could come to, if I was trying to be hopeful, besides the option of this is basically a crock of shit, that this is just back the force if it attacked, is so vague that it allows the United States to send out its diplomatic condolences or put out a statement in saying, oh, it's really sad that there's a war going on, or maneuver out of it, flexible, twist out of any responsibility, as the United States has done before. Or maybe it's air support. Maybe this is a statement that they'll have air power available to deploy missiles and other things against advancing Russian forces to take out any convoys or offensive actions that they might take. Of course, there's no idea of scale here. We don't even know if that's the correct back them if they are attacked. But maybe that's what they mean. I don't know. But it's kept very vague. And the way that you'll listen to your EU heads talk about the progress that was made, it sounds in their voice as if it wasn't vague, as if in this document it said America will send its troops to defend, or America will send its planes to defend. But essentially it said intelligence, logistics, and we will back them. The first two, you kind of probably can figure out. The last one, no clue. Lastly, on military support, the first line of defense for Kiev, signatories agree to, and I quote, long-term defense packages, financing and budget support, and practical and technical support to Ukraine, and building defensive fortifications. This is something that I think is more significant, because I was worried that the way we were going to approach it is essentially, sure, we'll come to your aid if something happens. Here's a bunch of weapons. Good luck. But if you have forces in the country and you're building defensive fortifications, you're actively not only making the country more difficult to invade because of the tripwire and the potential consequences, but you're also making it both physically harder to invade, both due to the smaller grouping of extra forces, but also the defensive fortifications across the country, which, if this was a longer peace settlement, the Ukrainians will have plenty of time to build. Okay. So what do I have to say about this? Is this the big progress that we've made that they're making of it? Is this the breakthrough that they're trying to paint it as? No, it's not. The issue of territory has still not been settled. The Russians are still demanding the rest of the Donbass. They're making up assassinations on Putin to demand even more land and make even harsher demands. The Russians are still positioning their forces to advance into the Dnipro region and deeper into the Zaporizhia region as they try to angle towards a position to get an artillery range of the Ukrainian regional capital. The Russians are still steadfast in annexing the rest of the Donbass. So we have still not gotten a settlement on that. And whether or not the United States is still ultimately going to keep demanding of Ukraine to pull out of this territory, this defensible territory, this elevated territory, the fortress belt that has been put up. I mean, what does that mean? That just means America spending more money down the line to build up another fortress belt in an area that's less elevated and looks more like the steppe. So I really am curious to know exactly what backing the force is. I want a clarification of that. And I think a clarification would do two things. Number one, and this is why they probably don't want to do it, it would tie America's hands. If you say this is what we will do, then that's what you have to do, or you undermine your own credibility. And America has already undermined a lot of their credibility when it comes to Ukraine. This is actually one of the reasons why before, when Ukraine gave up its atomic weapons, as American politicians held over food aid over Kiev during that period of starving, that period of economic chaos following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the agreement was Ukraine would get security assurances and such. Not, it wasn't a guarantee, it was a security assurance. And by using the word assurance, we could act like a snake. We could say, oh, assurance meant we actually don't really need to do fucking shit. It was just a bunch of made up bullshit. Assurance meant fuck you. That's what assurance meant. Guarantee, oh, that would mean we're best buddies. That would mean I'm reliable. I'm your partner. Assurance, it means fuck you. I know I don't mean to put it too vulgar, but that's how it felt to me when people were trying to wiggle out of it with the word assurance. Oh, we didn't guarantee anything. We just assured. Oh, yes. You sound like the devil himself, actually. Oh, I didn't sign your soul away. I merely gave it out to a proprietor. Like, no, stop using fancy words to explain snaky behavior, okay? It's not even wrapping it in the language of academia. It's just being a slimy prick. So until I know exactly what the settlement is going to be on Russia should not be taking any more territory. It shouldn't be taking any territory, period, but certainly it shouldn't be given territory it has not conquered, is not taken in battle, quote unquote. But also I need to know what backing Ukraine means. Because if you keep it flexible, then I understand that gives them more maneuverability. But then that stops the second reason that I would really think that this is important for them to do is if you don't, the second reason it's important for them to do, the second issue of note here, which I understand, they want maneuverability. But if you don't clarify that you're going to put troops on the ground, or you don't clarify they're going to do airstrikes, you don't clarify what you're going to do, what's going to end up happening is the Russians are going to call your bluff. Just like they called the bluff on a lot of Europe's support for Ukraine, just like they called the bluff on a lot when they invaded Ukraine. And so if you leave up an interpretation where actually America is not going to do anything, the Russians will be naively disastrous towards the outcome. They will assume the best will happen and then grind their skull against the worst. It's not just the Russian regime that has this tendency, but they certainly have it. The Iranians also have that tendency.